In monopoly and competition, I always get the narrow topics at these conferences. And what I thought I'd do today is talk about some of the differences between the Austrian view of competition versus the mainstream, or I guess you could call it a neoclassical view of competition. And since I'm kind of interested in history, I'd like to give you a little history of economic thought perspective on it. And a good just definition of the Austrian school view of competition is you can think of competition as a dynamic, rivalrous process of entrepreneurship that involves discovery. It discovers what works best in business. It helps businesses discover the optimal size or scale of their plant or factory or operation. It helps consumers discover what it is that they want to make their lives better. And so competition is an ongoing or never-ending evolutionary process. And economists from Adam Smith or before Adam Smith on who wrote about competition and the effects of competition on society all pretty much believed in this view of competition, which is sort of the ordinary person's view of competition. The person who's not a scholar or not a PhD economist, sure, thinks of competition as ongoing process of rivalry that involves price cutting and differentiating products by experimenting to see what the consumers want, using different business tactics, different strategies, different scales of operation to find out what works best in terms of what maximizes profits best. As far as that goes. This all changed, though. This all changed around the 1920s and 30s when the economics profession began trying to imitate the physical sciences, and this began before the 1920s and 30s, to make economics more scientific sounding. And so a new model was invented, and those of you who have taken economics, which is probably 99%, although we sometimes have a few engineers or doctors in the audience who are just here out of curiosity. But this all changed with the so-called perfect competition model that came into being really in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s in the world of economics. And this was very different. So the profession abandoned the old Adam Smith / Austrian view of competition as an ongoing or evolutionary process. And competition came to mean essentially those assumptions that you read in your textbooks about what constitutes competition. Many firms producing homogeneous products, homogeneous prices, perfect information, and free or costless entry and exit. There are other assumptions that economists have made over the years. Those are the main ones, though. And the purpose of this was to develop this model that I assume everybody has seen, the perfect competition model of competition, which can be used to understand what happens when consumer demand goes up and down, what happens to prices in the short run and long run. You've all studied that. It's not a useless model. I'm not saying that there's either you believe in the Austrian view or the mainstream view. That's not true. But that was the new model. And so the world of competition didn't change, the economic world, but the way in which economists looked at competition changed, their worldview. And of course, competition is a very important element of economics. And so there was really a radical change. This was a real revolution in economics. You've all heard of the Keynesian revolution. Well, there was also the imperfect competition revolution that took place around the same time because of the transformation and the understanding of what competition is. And probably my favorite article that explains the Austrian view of competition is an old article that Hayek wrote. I think he wrote this in the 1940s. It's pretty old, but it's called The Meaning of Competition, and it's in his book, Individualism and Economic Order. Individualism and Economic Order. I think that book was first published in 1964. It's probably for sale out here. There's so many books for sale out here that I lose track of what I used to know pretty much what the inventory was a few years ago, but there's hundreds of them now. And so, and of course, Mises wrote about competition and Rothbard and all the other Austrians. But this one seems to me to be a very succinct exposition of the Austrian view of competition and why it differs from the other view. And so I thought I'd give you talk about some of the implications of this. Take some of the assumptions. The first assumption: many firms. Competition requires many firms. This was never true in the eyes of economists before. I did a study once of what the views of economists were at the time the antitrust laws in America were originally adopted. The first antitrust law was the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890. And a co-author and I surveyed the entire economics profession. And at the time, there wasn't that many economists. There were several dozen people who had full-time jobs as economists at university, academic economists. So we were able to survey pretty much the entire population of the economics profession to see who has written anything on the subject of antitrust law and economics of competition. And what we found was there was almost unanimous agreement that this law, this anti-monopoly law that was passed, was opposed by the economics profession. There were only one or two people who were in favor of it. And the reason we argue is that we surveyed their opinions on antitrust regulation, and then we looked at, well, how do they view competition? And they all viewed competition the way Austrians do, as an evolving process, a dynamic discovery process, as Hayek would have called it. And so in light of that, they saw at their time, in the 1890s, the mergers, the corporate mergers that were taking place, and that there was a consolidation of some industries. They weren't at all concerned that would be harmful to consumers or society, because what they also saw was they saw prices going down. They saw the result of all these mergers is lower prices and newer and better products. And what's wrong with that? And so they were almost unanimously opposed in principle to antitrust laws. They weren't saying, well, I'm opposed to this antitrust law, but show me a better one and I might be in favor of it. They thought that these types of laws were inherently incompatible with competition as they understood it. And that's the view of most Austrians, I think. If you understand competition as a dynamic, rivalrous process, such laws can only short-circuit that process. And the one assumption I mentioned, many firms, at the beginning, as I said, in the 1890s, the fact that there were fewer firms in any industry was of no real concern to anybody. And so, but that all changed by the time you get to the 1930s and 40s with this new view of competition. There was great alarm over mergers and the reduction in the number of firms, because this became a defining characteristic or benchmark of competition. How many firms are there? And so up until the 1980s, there was a huge literature in the field of industrial organization that was developed that was searching, and there were sort of many witch hunts searching for monopolies under every rock in America and elsewhere in the world where they adopted these laws. And the one hallmark that the regulators would use was concentration ratios. They would try to find how concentrated is an industry. For example, a 4-firm concentration ratio would be the percentage of sales that the 4 largest firms in an industry have. And the magic number that the U.S. government picked was 60%. If there was any industry where the biggest 4 companies had 60% of sales, it was almost guaranteed that they would prosecute them. Even if they didn't have any reason to believe that they had been harming consumers, they would still file a lawsuit and sort of fish around. And this was so pervasive by the 50s that General Motors instructed all of its managers to try to make sure that they never got a market share above, I think it was 40%. I think that was the number, if I can recall from Alfred Chandler's business history, because they were afraid that if they got much more than that of a market share, they would be sued by the federal government for violating the antitrust laws simply for being really, really good at selling cars. Because that became the benchmark. It wasn't how competitive they were. And so what happened was economists failed to ask the question, well, how did you get that big market share? So the market share per se became suspect of monopolization. And the implicit assumption was always that, well, there must be some sort of collusion going on here. 4 or 5 firms have so much of the market. It must be some sort of collusion going on to get them to make so much profit. These questions were never even asked earlier than that when economists thought like the Austrians did. And so when you get about to the 1970s, and some economists started questioning this. The Austrian school economists never bought into this business of competition being determined solely by the number of firms in the industry or market share or concentration ratios. But some Chicago school economists started looking at this, and they were doing a lot of statistical studies, and lo and behold, they found all sorts of holes in the statistical studies purporting to show a correlation between industrial concentration and profitability. Okay, so there were all these studies that showed higher concentrated industries sometimes tend to have higher profits. But the bottom line was what the Chicago School economists found was that the reason for the higher profits was mostly economies of scale. Large-scale production that reduces cost increases your profit margin. And it wasn't conspiracy. And then the big question always was, well, what happened to the consumer as a result of all this concentration? And invariably, what happened was prices went down, production expanded, new products were invented, and so forth. And along these lines, I'll let you know, one of the points I would like to make is that your view of competition, your theory of competition, guides you when you do research in this area. And I'll give you one example of my own research. I had heard, I was an economics major in school, like a lot of you. I went and got my PhD. I'd been out for several years as a professor, and I'd always heard this story that, well, a lot of mistakes have been made by antitrust regulators over the years. However, there was once a golden age of antitrust, the 1890s, when it really was needed, and it really did. There was a rampant cartelization or monopolization, and some government bureaucrat in a big giant white horse rode into town and saved America from itself, saved capitalism from itself by regulating capitalism and mergers and things like that. And that's basically the story that you're all taught if you've ever read anything in a textbook in economics about antitrust. And that always sounded kind of fishy to me. And so I started looking around and asking. I asked a research assistant that I had to go to the library and look at every book that we have on antitrust and see if anyone has ever collected data to back up what the standard story says, that monopolists were restricting output, because that's what all the textbooks said. They just asserted that there were cartels that were restricting output, because that's the standard view of what monopolies do. It's not the Austrian view, but it's the standard view. And sure enough, we could not find one single book or journal article. This was in the 1980s. As of that time, we'd had antitrust laws for almost 100 years, and not a single economist had ever asked the question, well, is this true? That they were creating monopolies in the 19th century by the standard definition of monopoly. And so we gathered our own data. We went and gathered what data we could on this issue, and found that the industries that Congress was accusing of being monopolies in the late 1880s, every one of them was expanding output faster, sometimes 10 times faster than GDP was growing for the decade prior to the Sherman Antitrust Act. And so, and same with price. This was a period of declining prices. This consumer price index, for example, all of these industries were dropping prices faster than the consumer price index was falling during this time. So these were the most rapidly growing, technologically advanced, innovative businesses and industries in America, and they were being called monopolies. And so now, if I wouldn't have had this understanding of economics as a dynamic rivalrous process, I would never have gone down this road and asked these questions and done that kind of research. But I did. This was published in the International Review of Law and Economics in 1984, in ancient history. But that's one thing you would do, one kind of research you would get into if you understood the Austrian view as opposed to the mainstream view. You would never even, and obviously economists, modern economists never even asked themselves that question because no one had ever gathered these statistics. And I presented this paper at a lot of seminars in economics departments and conferences, and even if economists who didn't agree with me in my analysis agreed that it's kind of remarkable that everyone just accepted this as the truth and never really looked into it and asked, well, is it really true? It wasn't. And so what has happened is the Chicago School economists began more or less adopting the Austrian view of competition as being dynamic rather than static, and they called this the new learning in this field. But this was really the old learning. But they called it. There's a whole book called Industrial Organization, the New Learning, that has some of the more famous essays in this whole Chicago School world in it. Fred Weston was the main editor, I believe, of that book. And our friend Dominic Armentano, whose book is probably for sale out here, Antitrust and Monopoly, along the same lines, he investigated the 55 most famous federal government antitrust cases as of the early 1980s. And he found in every single case, 55 big federal antitrust cases against big companies, they had falling prices, expanding output, new products being invented, innovation, and whining competitors in every single case. And so, and Dom also, he's an Austrian school economist, and no mainstream economist probably would have taken the trouble to investigate such things because the way of thinking is different. So what the Chicago schoolers found really is that all these efforts to try to enhance competition by expanding the number of firms really was harmful to consumers, because if you break up a company that is big and profitable because it has low cost, you're going to raise the cost. It's pretty simple economics. I'll see. I can even draw a picture of what the new learning is. Here's a long-run average cost. Long-run average cost. So you have several big companies who have economies of scale, and they can produce at average cost one. The government comes in and breaks them up into smaller companies, and so since they're smaller, they don't have economies of scale. They produce at higher costs, and they pass as much of that higher cost on as they can to the consumers. And so for decades, that was government policy based on the ideology that concentration is unequivocally a bad thing. And it led to a misunderstanding of what mergers are all about. What a lot of mergers are about, there's an old theory of mergers called the Domino Theory of mergers, and the Domino Theory was sort of had an ominous implication to it. I see a few old geezers in the room like myself, and we remember the Domino Theory of communism. You let the commies take over one country, and the whole world will eventually become communist unless we go in and bomb. In the 1950s, this same language, domino theory, was used to describe markets. That is, if you see say you see two or three mergers of corporations in, say, the banking industry, and then a few other firms, you see 4 and 5 and 6 mergers of firms. There was this domino theory that said essentially what's going to happen is you're going to end up with just one big firm, one big company. Karl Marx was fond of that theory too. It was called Karl Marx's theory, one big corporation running the world. And so it's very ominous sounding. We don't want the commies to take over Southeast Asia, and we don't want we don't want one big company to take over the world either. And so, but economists who actually did empirical investigations of this found that there was an alternative explanation of what's going on with these merger waves. They're sometimes called merger waves, not always called domino theory. It was that, say you had 10 companies operating in an industry, and each of them has an average cost of $10 of producing their product. 2 companies merge, and the synergy from the merger results in the fact that they can now produce this product for $5. It gives them a competitive advantage. What's likely to happen? What are the competitors likely to do then? If they see there's this one company that has cost per unit that's half of what ours is, how did they do that? Well, they merged and they combined forces in a certain way that allowed them to do that. Well, the other companies are going to investigate if it's possible for them to reduce their costs also through that vehicle, through mergers, economies of scale. And so you would end up maybe with 5 firms instead of 10, all with average cost of $5, and they would pass on at least some of that cost reduction, since it is a competitive industry still. There's always a threat of potential competition, not just existing competition, and the end result would be lower prices. And so this was no threat to consumers after all, in the Domino Theory. But that was a famous theory back in the 50s and 60s. Another of the assumptions of this perfect competition model, and Hayek, by the way, in this article I cited, one of his famous lines was, "In perfect competition, there is no competition." And so, merger is a way of competing. But if you outlaw that, there is no way of competing by merger. Another aspect, one final aspect of mergers, I guess I'll throw in here, is that mergers are often a way in which the market for corporate control works. Mergers are takeovers. A company that's being poorly managed and is bought up by another company or by a group of investors. Why do they do that? Well, they think they can manage it better. That's why they think they can do that, because that's the only way they can make money. They spend millions or billions buying up this company that they think is being poorly managed. Why would they do that? Well, the only way they could profit is that if they get that company and make the profit rate make more profit, so that the stock price goes up after they acquired all these shares of stock to take over ownership. That's the only way they could benefit from it. And so, in a lot of cases, what mergers are, or takeovers, are simply a case of one group of management attempting to do a better job than the existing managers are. It doesn't always work out, but that's how the market for corporate control works. It disciplines bad management. And proof that is really true is that a couple of dozen states in the United States have passed laws making takeovers or mergers more difficult. Because these are these laws are lobbied for by corporate executives who think they're college professors, and they want tenure. They don't want to have to compete for their jobs by takeover specialist or somebody else, and so they've made it more difficult for these mergers to take place. One of the other assumptions, the homogeneous product assumptions, has created a lot of mischief. The Austrian view is that, well, of course, product differentiation and innovation is a natural part of competition. So is advertising, as far as that goes. But if you really take this assumption seriously, homogeneous products is the ideal world. You would be suspicious about advertising product differentiation, and this came into view in the 1930s during the monopolistic competition revolution. There were two big books written by Joan Chamberlain and Joan Robinson and Edward Chamberlain, not Joan Chamberlain. It wasn't Edward G. Robinson. I think it was Joan Robinson and an economist. There were two British economists, and they wrote basically the same book about monopolistic competition, which I always thought when I was an undergraduate student even that this sounded like an oxymoron. Monopolistic competition is like jumbo shrimp or military intelligence or something. Those of you who don't like country music would say country music. I know a lot of people. One of the guys I work with hates country music. You'd have to put a gun to his head to make him listen to country music, but he would think that's an oxymoron. But monopoly. How can you monopolistic competition? And of course, those of you who have studied this know that this was based on this new theory that if a company differentiated its product just a little bit, say we're selling tires, and I put a white ring around my tires, well, even if it's physically the same tire, my tire is different. Or if I take out ads and I advertise, even in the minds of consumers, my product is a tiny bit different than yours. We're all monopolists because we all have a unique single product, and that's the definition of monopoly by the standard view, a single seller. And so if we can create in the minds of consumers that our products are differentiated, then we can declare that there's monopoly everywhere. And so that was another part of the crusade to regulate business in a very sort of a pervasive way, because there is monopoly everywhere. So the markets hadn't changed, but the theory of markets changed, and all of a sudden economists began declaring that just about everything is a monopoly. Paul Samuelson wrote the biggest selling textbook in economics in 1948. It's called a very flashy title, Economics. Like I once read Mussolini's autobiography, and it was called My Autobiography. It's like something like a third grader would write, my autobiography. But economics. I guess, well, what else would you call Samuelson's book? But for decades, he explained the standard mainstream view of competition, and if you really look at these assumptions, homogeneous products, many firms, and so forth, it's really a narrow field of companies that you could see, or industries that would really fit in there. And in the 1976 version of Samuelson's book, he said, he asked, well, which industries are competitive? And he says, a few agricultural industries, and that's it. Everything else is monopolistic of some sort. And of course, if it's monopolistic, you need government regulation to force it to be competitive. And he even got that wrong, a few agricultural industries. Because of agricultural regulation, a lot of these agricultural industries with price supports and acreage allotments, they were really monopolistic because of agricultural policy. So he even got that wrong as far as that's concerned. And all this led the economist Harold Demsetz, he's retired from UCLA now, to coin the phrase nirvana fallacy. Let's see. Be a good name for a porn star, wouldn't it? Nirvana fallacy. It just popped into my head. Nirvana fallacy. Maybe it is. I don't know. Let's see. Harold Demsetz. This was in an article in the Journal of Law and Economics. I believe it was around 1970. It was called Information and Efficiency, Another Viewpoint. And I'm just going to mention the phrase here, nirvana fallacy, because it's a really good way of thinking about what happened to the theory of competition. And basically he's saying this new model of competition, and Demsetz is not an Austrian, but he's kind of close. He was saying this new model of competition sets up sort of a nirvana world, some sort of perfect world, perfect competition that is never achievable on Earth. How could you possibly have an industry with homogeneous products, everyone charges the exact same price, always many firms, perfect information, and costless entry and exit? And so the method of analysis of the mainstream economists was to say, okay, here's the benchmark, all those assumptions, and then look at the world, look at the steel industry, look at the car industry. And I used to call it aha economics, AHA exclamation mark. And because they would say, aha, the market has failed because it's not perfect. It's not like nirvana. It's not like heaven on earth. And then, of course, if the market fails, well, the corollary to that is that government must step in and force the market to succeed somehow. And he coined the phrase nirvana fallacy because obviously, there's nothing on earth is perfect, like nirvana. And so it was really, I always consider this sort of fraudulent form of analysis to do this. And the same economists who would always propose government regulation of markets because they were imperfect would never apply the same criteria, Pareto optimality, to government. They would just assume government would be perfect in its regulation of industry. And because, why not? Why not have some sort of theory of perfect government and then say, well, how does government diverge from perfection? And of course, all of these failures of markets that they talked about are amplified over and over by orders of magnitude when you come to government operations. And the public choice economics has done a lot of that, and a lot of the Austrians have studied bureaucracy and politics. Hayek's Volume 3 of Law, Legislation, and Liberty is all about, not all about, but a lot of it is about essentially public choice economics or political economy. Mises, one of his earliest books, was entitled Bureaucracy. And so the Austrians have done a lot on understanding bureaucracy. Rothbard, read Power and Market, Rothbard's analysis of the operation of government, and you'll get an idea of how imperfect government can be as well as markets, according to the standard view. And so that's the nirvana fallacy. But on the homogeneous products, I began talking about the mischief that was done with this assumption, is that it's not just a blackboard exercise assuming that homogeneous products is a good thing. There have been many famous government regulatory cases instances of companies being ruined, if not ruined, harassed for years for differentiating their products. Probably the most famous case to economists, anyway, who study these things was a case in the U.S. in the 1970s that is known as the cereals case. Cereals as in breakfast cereal. And at the time, Kellogg's, General Mills, and General Foods companies had about 70% of the dry cereal market. And they had been experimenting with all different kinds of cereals, and as had other companies, but their brands really hit it off. This was probably at the time when Americans became much more health conscious and started eating healthier cereals and things like granola and wheat and grain cereals rather than corn, which they feed to cows and pigs and that sort of thing. But anyway, these companies had gained a big market share, 70%, and so the Federal Trade Commission more or less automatically sued them for violating the antitrust laws on the basis of having a big market share. And they hired a well-known industrial organization economist who had been publishing a famous textbook. His name is Friedrich for a while. The FTC, Federal Trade Commission, hired him to invent a theory to back up their lawsuit. And he invented the theory of shared monopoly. And he claimed that, well, this is not a monopoly because there are three companies, and a monopoly is one company, but they're sharing a monopoly. How are they sharing a monopoly? He developed another theory called brand, with a D, proliferation. Not brand proliferation, but it was brand proliferation, but he had a D on it, brand proliferation. So he came up with this big mathematical model explaining how, because if you have brand proliferation in a shared monopoly, you won't have perfectly competitive equilibrium. You'll have something else other than nirvana. And that was the basis of the lawsuit. But eventually the federal courts threw it out and ruled in favor of the cereal companies. And this was when, in reading some of the history of this, the federal judge who was presiding over the case at one point, talking to all these economic experts that the government had brought in, said something to the effect that, well, I don't even like dry cereal. I eat bacon and eggs in the morning. And he was making the case that there are a lot of substitutes for dry cereal, even if they did have 100% of the market, and they charge double the price. Well, you eat bagels for breakfast. You don't need to eat cereal. No one's holding a gun to your head. And it must have been a moment where Friedrich thought, I never thought of that. I don't know if he saw. I doubt that he said that, but it should be pretty obvious to anybody. Even a lawyer understood it. This judge, and so. But with this kind of regulation, even if you win the lawsuit, you lose because you've spent millions of dollars and you've diverted management talent for years away from your business to fight the government. And that of course, is what happened to Microsoft. They spent like 8 or 9 years diverting the attention of Bill Gates and the top management to fighting the government's harassment of them instead of building better products, which is exactly what their competitors wanted to happen. They're the ones who instigated this lawsuit. So that's an example of how this homogeneous products assumption has caused a lot of trouble. The other assumption of perfect information in the model, it's hard to believe anyone would take that seriously. But if you take this seriously as a benchmark of competition, what do you suppose would be the role of advertising if perfect competition means perfect information? There's no role out for it at all. If consumers know what they want and how to get it and and everybody knows how to produce that, but what the market does is it reveals to us all this information. The process of competition reveals to consumers what they want. I don't know who would, 30 years ago, who would have known that they would have wanted a laptop computer? You don't know what you want. So the process of competition reveals to you things that will make your life better. The same on the business side, on the supply side. Businesses, they don't know what the optimal scale of plant is. They don't know whether merging with one of their competitors will result in more profits or not. They do a lot of research on it, and there's some guesswork too, and they take risks in doing it. But the market, the only way to find out what the optimal configuration of industry is to let the market reveal it to us and let us know what works and what doesn't. And on that point, the same economist, I didn't intend to beat up on Friedrich today, but he co-authored a book with another economist named David Kammershen, who are both well-known industrial organization economists, and they looked at several thousand mergers, corporate mergers, that had taken place over decades, and with a database that came from the Federal Trade Commission because they had either regulated or threatened to regulate all these mergers. And they came to the conclusion that over about a 30-year period, I think it was, that about half of these mergers didn't work out, that they didn't reduce costs and increase profitability, and so the companies spun off the company that it had acquired previously. And they used this result to make the case that we need more government regulation of mergers so that the government, the smart guys in the government, with perfect foresight of the future, can tell these companies, no, we know with certainty that 10 years down the road you're not going to have lower costs. So therefore, no permission. You can't merge. And I'm sort of being trying to make jokes of this, but that's exactly what they were saying. That somehow some central planner in the government knows better than the people who are risking their own capital. Now the people who risk their own capital will make mistakes, but the incentive is all in direction of avoiding the mistakes. Because if you make the mistakes, you lose your capital. It's your capital. If the government bureaucrat makes a mistake and prohibits a merger that may have saved consumers tens of billions of dollars, nothing happens to him. Nothing. He might get promoted for being a good hard-nosed regulator, And so nothing happens to him because he has nothing at stake. He hasn't invested a penny of his own money. And so, yes, businessmen make mistakes, but they pay for those mistakes. But when regulators make mistakes, they don't pay for them, and nothing happens to them. In fact, I've never worked in the federal government myself. I don't think I could stomach it, but I have friends who have, and they've told me quite a few stories. My old friend Rick Stroop, as some of you might know something about the free market environmentalist movement. Rick Stroop is a big name in that. And he worked at the Department of Interior for a couple of years during the Reagan administration. And he, one of his speeches that he gave in an economics department where I was, he gave the example of some guy there, the government bureaucrat, who was just the biggest screw up in the whole Department of Interior, and everybody knew it. And anyway, there was a dam out west in the western part of the United States that the engineers who worked for the Department of Interior thought was unsafe from an engineering perspective, and some money needed to be spent fixing this dam or it will burst. And the screw up was on the other side. No, this is safe. And he won. His argument prevailed in front of a congressional committee. And so they did not do anything to fix the dam. And then sure enough, the dam burst and a bunch of people died. Homes were lost. And the story that Rick Stroop has told, I heard him tell us at a seminar, was that this person had a history of doing this sort of thing. I mean, big screw-ups. I mean, you're causing a dam to burst. That's a pretty big, how would you like to be responsible for that? Something like that. But then in the government, the only way to get rid of the screw-ups is to promote them. Because if you fire them, you're going to have a federal employee union lawsuit to deal with, which will make you, the manager, your life miserable maybe for years. Who wants to do that? So so how do you entice them to get out of your hair? You offer them a promotion of some kind. And the end of Rick Stroop's story was that at the time I heard him tell this story, Rick had been out of this job for several years, but he said he heard through his old contacts that this guy had been promoted 3 times since he left the Department of Interior. And so, yes, businessmen and women make mistakes, but they pay for them. And on the other side, of course, if they make the good decisions, they profit. They make money from them for the good merger decisions. But that kind of feedback not only does not exist in government, but it's the opposite. Failure is success in a lot of times, just because of the way things operate. Okay. Now, some of the other critiques, Murray Rothbard, I would encourage everybody to read Chapter 10 of Man, Economy, and State on monopoly. And it's really great. Murray made some really outstanding contributions to the theory of monopoly and understanding of competition. And I can mention a few of the things he mentioned here. And he starts out with a critique of the idea of consumer sovereignty that is popular in this field of economics, in this subdiscipline. A lot of the regulation of monopoly, so-called monopoly regulation, is based on the idea that, what do monopolists do? They supposedly restrict output, we're told. And what does that do? That raises prices. And we have this monopoly model. I drew a picture of it here. Here's a standard monopoly model in the constant cost industry. And the standard model says, well, this would be the competitive level of output here, QC. This is the monopoly level of output. There's an output restriction. And we have deadweight loss here. This is a loss of consumer surplus to the consumer. Therefore, the government should come in, break up this monopoly, force output from QM to QC for the benefit of the consumer. That's the standard story that we're told in all the textbooks. And it's all based on this idea of consumer sovereignty to some extent. But Murray asked the question of, why consumer sovereignty? Why not individual sovereignty? Why does the business person not have sovereignty? Or why is his or her well-being not relevant? If you and I are in Auburn, Alabama, and we're selling television sets, and we're the only two television set salesmen in Auburn, and we're in a recession, we're in the Greenspan recession, and we're on the verge of going bankrupt and having to lay off all our employees, and we get together. This might be a stupid thing to do in a recession, but it's our property. What if we say, well, let's sell these $200 TVs for $250 because we need the cash? Of course, we will sell fewer televisions as a result, depending on the elasticity of demand. But we decide to do that. We're gonna get together. That is strictly illegal. Can't do that. That would be price fixing. That is illegal in the United States. But it's really it really is a denial of our private property rights. That it's our property. We want to sell our property to anybody who will buy it at some agreed upon price. And so the government is denying that we have sovereignty over our own property. And Rothbard asks the question, well, why is that necessarily a good thing? That the consumer is sovereign, but no one else is. No one else in the market. And that's a pretty good point. And also on the whole issue of output restriction as the benchmark of monopoly. And it supposedly results in this deadweight loss here. This is a amount of production that never takes place, therefore it can't benefit consumers if it doesn't exist, this shaded area of the diagram there. Well, if this output is reduced, and we're talking about land, labor, capital, natural resources that are withdrawn from production, well, they'll be reallocated somewhere else. They'll be put to use somewhere else. And so you'll have an expansion of output somewhere else. And so if you look at a more sort of a general equilibrium view, a more general view of this, you can't make the argument that if in the free market, if some companies do reduce output in this way, that there is an overall reduction in output in the economy, because this will create an expansion of output someplace else. And so who's to say overall that on net there's been a reduction in output? And then, of course, a standard assumption by Austrians is that it's impossible to make interpersonal utility comparisons. So when you're talking about a government policy, let's say, that benefits the consumer at the expense of the seller or the producer, you cannot make a statement that welfare or social welfare, something like social welfare, which is in the language of economics, has increased, because you can't measure utility, well-being, and you can't make interpersonal utility comparisons. It's subjective. Utility is subjective. And so who's to say that social welfare has been increased or decreased? Can't do that at all. My old professor, Gordon Tullock, he was old when he was my professor, and he's really old now, still around. But when he used to be very Austrian on this point, and he was always trying to start an argument with everybody, because he was trained as a trial lawyer, not an economist, and he at least liked to argue. And so when he would mention it, I heard him mention this on several occasions. He would give an example about the impossibility of making interpersonal utility comparisons. He would say, well, if you really believe it is possible to make interpersonal utility comparisons, here's my proposal to increase social utility. We're going to go out and gather up a few homeless people in town. and we're going to boil them in oil on closed-circuit television and charge $100 a head to watch it. You will greatly increase the utility of the viewers who will get a kick out of watching human beings be boiled in oil. And since they're homeless people, they don't have much utility anyway, so there will be a loss of utility, but it's only 2 or 3 guys, and of course, it seems very crass and crude to talk about that. But it was a memorable example of the absurdity of making interpersonal utility comparisons and basing policy on that. And of course, a lot of nonsense has taken place under this sort of assumption that it is possible, and a lot of catastrophes. The old saying, Stalin is attributed to saying you have to break a few eggs to make an omelet, as a way of referring to his mass murder of tens of millions of people in the Soviet Union. I don't know if he actually said that or not, but it certainly was his policy. And so, but underlying that is, well, why are we doing this? Why are we murdering all these people? Well, it's for social utility. It's maximizing social utility, social welfare. And so, of course, Rothbard also looked at output restriction as the hallmark of monopoly by asking some other questions. And I would ask these questions like. Let's see, do we have any fighting? I know we probably have some cage fighting fans here. It was boxing in my day. When Muhammad Ali retired, I quit watching boxing. It became boring to me. But on television, I see cage fighting now. But whoever is the world heavyweight champion boxer in the world today, I don't even know. I don't follow it anymore. But how many times do you think these guys fight? I know Ali's daughter is a fighter now. I watch her once in a while. But how many times would these guys fight per year, do you think? 2 or 3 times, something like that? Maybe they're probably required to keep their belt twice or something like that. Well, they're obviously restricting output. Did you ever watch the movie Fight Club? Brad Pitt fought almost every night in that movie. Why not? Why shouldn't the government force these people to fight at least 100 times? What? They're restricting output. Look at all the professors who are teaching here. We don't even teach in the summer. We're restricting output. I'm not in class right now. I'm goofing off in Auburn, Alabama. But on a more serious note, one example, I was at a conference once where there was a Federal Trade Commission economist bragging about all the lawsuits they were filing against businesses. And the example he gave was they determined that car dealers in Detroit in the winter months were shutting down at 5 o'clock in the evening. And if you're familiar with cities like Detroit, once business hours are over, it's a ghost town. There's nobody there. People go in and they work. But once work is over, you walk around, they roll up the sidewalks, as they say in these places. And so if there's no people around, why would you want to keep your business open and the lights on and your employees have to be paid and all this? And so they were contemplating, this guy said at the time, suing all the automobile dealers in Detroit for restricting output, for closing down at 5 o'clock. And forcing them to stay open maybe till 9 o'clock. And I asked him if that means that forced labor is a prerequisite for economic efficiency. And the answer, of course, would have been yes. He didn't answer, but yes, of course. That's what he was saying, forced labor. And so when you think of this output restriction as the measuring rod of competition, it leaves a lot wanting, doesn't it? It's because when you think about it, it does require forced labor if you're serious about this. One of the books that economists who study antitrust know, it's considered to be a kind of a classic. It's okay. It's by Robert Bork. It's called The Antitrust Paradox. And in this book, he makes one very Austrian-sounding comment. He says, if we really take these assumptions of the perfect competition model seriously, and the government really tried to enforce this, Bork said that it would have roughly the same effect on the U.S. economy as several strategically placed nuclear explosions. It would destroy the economy if if the government had enough resources to really enforce all this stuff. And so, and he was right. He was right. And he was a Chicago School law and economics scholar before he became. Some of you probably know he was nominated to the Supreme Court 20-some years ago, didn't make it. There was a huge controversy over that. But he was a federal judge before that and a law professor at Yale for many years. He taught antitrust at Yale, and that's when he wrote this book, The Antitrust Paradox. One final point I'll make here is I'll give you another example of this view of competition as a dynamic, rivalrous process of entrepreneurship and where it can lead you. Another one of my articles that was published in, see the date here, the Review of Austrian Economics in 1996 was on the topic of natural monopoly, the regulated utilities. And this is another example of my thinking of, I had been taught this story that you've all been taught if you took microeconomics, that at some point in time, economies of scale developed in certain industries, and it led to one big company threatening to take over the whole industry because it developed those economies of scale quicker than anybody else. And so that it would develop a monopoly and no one else would be able to compete. And so the wise and benevolent government supposedly stepped in and said, okay, we want this monopoly, so let's grant them a franchise monopoly. Let's make it illegal to compete. So we'll have the benefits of these economies of scale, but then we'll regulate the price in the public interest. We'll make sure the price doesn't go to monopoly levels. That's the standard story of why the electric power, natural gas, telephone, cable television were government-imposed monopolies for many, many years. And that always sounded kind of fishy to me as well as other people. And so I did a little digging around to find the origins of this. And what really happened was companies were competing, and they were trying to form cartels, but they were always failing because cartels are notoriously unstable. And how these monopolies came about is they essentially cut a deal with governments. And I'll read a quote from a book on this. It's called this is what kind of books professors read in the summertime. The history of the Gas Light Company of Baltimore. It was published a long time ago by George T. Brown. I got onto this book because a famous economist named Richard T. Ely, who was the co-founder of the American Economic Association, wrote a lot of the essays that are and articles that are cited in this book. And he wrote a lot. He was a Johns Hopkins professor at the turn of the century, the 20th century, and so he was pretty well known for this. And he did a lot of studies of the Gaslight Company of Baltimore. So this author, George T. Brown, relied somewhat on Ely in his work. But here's how regulated monopoly in the public interest came to Maryland, where Richard T. Ely was at the time, Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore. A bill was introduced into the Maryland legislature which called for an annual payment to the city from the Consolidated Gas Company of $10,000 a year and 3% of all dividends declared in return for the privilege of enjoying a 25-year monopoly, end quote. And so they wanted a monopoly, but they couldn't get it. There was too much competition. So they cut a deal with the government, make us a monopoly, make it illegal for competition to exist, and we will share the loot with you. We'll give you $10,000 and 3% of all dividends. And the politicians decided, well, good deal. We'll take it. And so all around the country, they replicated the same system. And that's how there was nothing natural about this. As far as, natural implies it happened on the free market. It did not. And so that's just a total myth. And Harold Dempseth, the same economist I quoted a minute ago, he studied this too. He looked into, were there monopolies in the late 19th, early 20th centuries that justified natural monopoly regulation? And here's something he wrote in one of his articles. He said there were 6 electric light companies in 1 year organized in 1887 in New York City. 45 electric light enterprises had legal right to operate in Chicago in 1907. Prior to 1895, Duluth, Minnesota was served by 5 electric lighting companies. During the latter part of the 19th century, competition was the usual situation in the gas industry, and on and on and on. Same with telephones. There was a lot of competition, but it was all destroyed by regulation. There's nothing natural about it. And again, like I said, if most economists just accept this as, and when they do talk about natural monopoly regulation, they usually talk about, the actual regulation that's taken place has been imperfect and it's created some problems. But so we as economists, our job is to tell the regulators how to do a better job in regulating these things. But if you're an Austrian economist or think about competition like the Austrians do, you'll ask the more fundamental question of is this necessary at all? Why not let the free market regulate these industries? Why do we need politicians, and especially local politicians, like the ones in Washington, D.C. You want to put them in charge. In Maryland, where I live, give you a good example of how wise regulation has turned out. In the year 2000, they passed a law that they called a deregulation law. We have a guy from Maryland right here. I don't know if you know about this or remember this. They called it a deregulation law, and a part of that law said the price of electricity will be regulated at 1996 prices, not 2000 prices, 1996 prices, which were lower for the next 6 years. And they called that deregulation. And then they said, the reason we're doing this is we want more companies to come into Maryland to sell electricity. More companies. Hold the price down at 10, what it was 10 years ago. And boy, the competition will just come flooding in. And then of course the 6 years was up. And so all of a sudden they said, they declared, and their propaganda stooges at the Baltimore Sun, for about 2 months, the headline was "Deregulation has failed," and every day, gee, I wonder what the headline today is going to be. I think deregulation has failed for months, and I started reading this stuff, and they would even say in the articles that they regulated the price for 6 years, and therefore deregulation has failed, and so of course no companies came in, and because of the regulation. And so they said, now what we need is more regulation because deregulation has failed. And so what they've done is, I think electric prices went up 85% last year because of this, and they don't know what to do. They have no idea what to do. They're talking about maybe building some windmills in the ocean off of Rehoboth Beach or off Ocean City to do something about this. And so that's where regulation in Maryland has gotten us. The governor took the heroic stance last week of the governor of Delaware says, I want to build windmills 3 miles out in the ocean off of Rehoboth Beach, Delaware. And our heroic governor in Maryland said, okay, that's a good idea, but we're not going to have him in Maryland yet. He's doing this and seeing what the people will say about windmills in the ocean. And so that's what's going to happen. And the same thing happened in California some years ago. I was in Santa Monica when they had blackouts, and because of the regulation of utilities, and they had rolling blackouts because they would just shut the power off in different parts of LA because they said, well, we can't announce them in advance. If we did, all the criminals would know where to go to break into the banks and everything because the alarms would not work without electricity and all that. And so when the power went on, the news people were saying the governor is going to make an announcement about what he's going to do to save us from this crisis. And this went on for days. When is the governor going to get out of his swivel chair? And the governor finally got out. I was actually watching TV when they gave the alert that the governor is leaving his office. And I'm thinking, there's somebody is pretty much saying the governor has got up out of his swivel chair. And he comes in a big press conference. And he said, we have decided to continue paying the people in Palm Springs who operate those windmills. And then he turned around and left. That's how the Terminator became governor of California. They had a recall, kick that guy out, and put another socialist in his place. And so I think time's about up.